What Galileo did was provide a radically new way of looking at the world. He defended a bunch of different theories, and none of these theories were very well supported, but they cohered together rather nicely. Still, overall, according to Feyerabend, even if the geocentric astronomy had problems, the heliocentric astronomy was in far greater trouble. So how did Galileo's procedure pay off? Well, recall our earlier discussion of Mill. Feyerabend agrees with Mill that the key to intellectual progress is proliferation of different ideas. Very often, Feyerabend suggests, we can't examine a theory from the inside, as it were. I can't fully examine the theories I hold unless I confront them with well-developed competitors. Theories have all sorts of hidden assumptions, and we're often unable to see the problems with the theory, not least because theories influence how we observe the world. Recall the points raised in the video on incommensurability. The best way to reveal the problems with theories is to create radically different theories and even different methods. So a kind of counter-inductive procedure of generating theories that contradict accepted results, that always has a chance of success. Feyerabend thinks that there should be no limits on where we get these alternative theories from. He says, and I quote, "There is no idea, however ancient or absurd, that is not capable of improving our knowledge." So it may be of benefit to biologists to attempt to defend young Earth creationism. We all think that young Earth creationism is absurd, perhaps even dangerous, but by adopting the theory tenaciously, if a biologist comes along who just says, I'm going to defend young Earth creationism, come what may, I'm going to ignore its problems and just try to increase its power, well, that may well prompt a conceptual revolution, or at the very least, it will force accepted evolutionary theory to become more sophisticated via the competition. And I suppose there, in fact, may already be cases where, in arguing with creationists, people who defend contemporary evolutionary theory have had their attention drawn to problems that they perhaps were unaware of. So it's this competition between different theories that drives both of them to greater heights. Now the question arises, how exactly can we persuade people to adopt hypotheses that are contradicted by the available evidence, hypotheses that are incompatible with other well-established theories, hypotheses that are rejected by the scientific community, that have a history of stagnation and failure and so on? I mean, clearly we're not going to be able to persuade people by any rational means. So Feyerabend says it's perfectly acceptable to use irrational means, to use propaganda and appeals to emotion and prejudice. It's fine to just accept a theory on pure blind faith and then to promote it in whatever ways you like, whatever ways you can to persuade people to come to your cause. You don't have to use rational argument. So that's a fairly uncomfortable idea for those of us who are accustomed to promoting scientific rationality. Now, Feyerabend argues that one consequence of his thesis is the disunity of science. Science is not a single thing. There is obviously a single word, science, but there isn't really anything corresponding to that word. The various activities that we call science don't have anything in common. So Feyerabend rejects the demarcation problem. He thinks there just is no demarcation between science and non-science because there isn't such a thing really as science. There is nothing that all of these different activities have in common. So scientists do certainly adopt very different values and methods. So for example, some scientists are narrowly concerned with generating the right predictions, and they don't care much for philosophical speculation about what their theories mean. A popular attitude among many physicists is, shut up and calculate. The theory works, that's all that matters. You don't need to understand the theory so long as you can use it to get the right predictions. Einstein would probably have been pretty appalled by this, and plenty of contemporary physicists also object. Lee Smolin, for example, certainly doesn't agree with this kind of attitude. David Magnus, in his article Down the Primrose Path, discusses that in early debates concerning Darwinism, there were biologists in the naturalist tradition, and they made observations of life in the wild. They might make collections from wild organisms. And on the other hand, there were the experimentalists who focused on performing controlled experiments in laboratories. Now, the naturalists tended to emphasize consilience and breadth. They preferred sort of gathering evidence from a wide variety of sources in its natural context and then developing theories that applied to large classes of phenomena. On the other hand, the experimentalists placed more weight on experimental control and replication and developing theories that addressed very specific experimentally tractable problems. Similar debates are occurring in science all of the time, similar disagreements about the proper method. Some scientists feel that scientific work should be strongly constrained by moral norms. Some of the objections that have been raised against theories of racial naturalism or theories in evolutionary psychology have been more about the possible bad social consequences of such theories in terms of encouraging racism or sexism. So that's a sort of moral objection to engaging in those kinds of theories. Other scientists actively enjoy challenging contemporary moral attitudes. And this list of disagreement in science can go on indefinitely. Now, for Feyerabend, this competition between methods and values, this is a central aspect of science. This isn't sort of part of the periphery. It's not something that we should hope will one day go away. It should, if anything, be encouraged. Science is not a unified enterprise. It's not unified by any particular method or value or anything like that. Different scientists have completely different ideas and work in completely different ways. So that's Feyerabend's general view of science. Let's turn to some objections. First of all, Feyerabend rests his argument primarily on an analysis of Galileo. But this was relatively early science. The Copernican revolution is often considered to be the birth of modern science. So it's quite questionable whether conclusions about Galileo can be extended to modern science. Perhaps it was necessary to violate what we would consider proper scientific method during the birth of science, but then as science became established, a good method did become laid down. I mean, science at the time of Galileo was breaking away from a completely different worldview in a way that really hasn't happened since. So, as I say, can we apply the conclusions about Galileo to modern science? It's not obvious. I mean, certainly there are some clear differences between the science of Galileo's day and modern science. So just as one example, much modern science is what's known as big science. Big science emerged around World War II. And this phrase, big science, refers to science that involves large-scale research projects carried out by big research teams using very complex equipment. Think of the research going on at the Large Hadron Collider or the use of the Hubble Space Telescope. This research is very expensive, very time-consuming. It takes a lot of manpower. Feyerabend liked to emphasize eccentric individuals with radical ideas fighting against the establishment, these sort of heroic individuals. And that's what Galileo was. He worked alone, he built his own telescope, he came up with his own ideas. But it's not really clear that there's much room in modern science for that kind of person. Now, Feyerabend would probably accept this point, but he'd say it's a bad thing. He'd say that science has become too conservative. It should be more open to radicals. And I have to say, to some extent, I kind of share Feyerabend's attitude. I find big science kind of depressing. I think science was cooler when it was driven by eccentric amateurs rather than, teams. I hate teams. But it seems that big science is kind of inevitable. As knowledge progresses, it takes more money and more effort to make new developments. And given how much time and effort it takes to develop scientific theories today, it might just be unrealistic to focus on exploring loads of radical possibilities as Feyerabend suggests. So, another problem. Let's assume that that Feyerabend's appeal to Galileo is relevant. Still, there are some concerns about this argument. So recall how I reconstructed Feyerabend's argument. You might want to go back and check that when I put it into the different premises. I mean, the obvious way to respond to it is to deny premise 3 and to try to show that actually Galileo did follow some suggested scientific method. Obviously, that would require detailed historical scholarship, which I'm not going to do, but another possibility is to deny premise 2, deny that Galileo was a great scientist. That might not be as extreme as it seems. For one thing, as I mentioned above, science in Galileo's day was still in its infancy, so in general, science as a whole may not have been as good then as it is today, or as it was later. Galileo may have been the best scientist of his day, but because standards back then were lower, he still doesn't compare favourably to the modern scientist, the average modern scientist. People at the time of Galileo were still struggling to develop new canons of science, so really it's no surprise that they routinely flouted proper methods. It's a struggle to develop proper methods, given where they were starting from. Many scientists have been rebels and have held unpopular beliefs. We don't remember them because they were wrong. We treat Galileo as a heroic scientist because we now know that he was right. And, well, I guess also because despite being right, he faced persecution from the church establishment. But in many ways, he was right by accident. Right? There were serious problems with heliocentrism. It was unpopular for a good reason. We know that Galileo was right on the basis of later developments. Later research established the Copernican system quite conclusively. Well, I mean, not the system that Copernicus and Galileo defended, but the basic idea that the Earth orbits the Sun. The Earth is not the fixed centre of the universe. That was established quite conclusively by later developments. Now, Feyerabend's argument is that if you adopt any universal scientific method, then you have to conclude that Galileo wasn't acting rationally. So scientists in Galileo's day shouldn't have accepted his arguments, if they were acting rationally at least. But of course, I mean, there's something of a problem here because obviously scientists didn't accept his arguments. For many decades after Galileo, one or the other geocentric system was favoured by the intellectual community. A popular alternative to traditional geocentrism and to heliocentrism was the Tychonic system developed by Tycho Brahe, where the Earth was the fixed centre of the universe, the Sun revolved around the Earth, and all of the other planets revolved around the Sun. So it was sort of a combination of traditional geocentrism and heliocentrism. So anyway, the situation is that a new theory is proposed, but there wasn't enough evidence in its favour at first, and it had all kinds of problems. Although Galileo defended it quite tenaciously, most other scientists rejected it. It was only later, after most of the problems had been resolved and more evidence accumulated, that the theory was accepted. That kind of looks like science working as we'd all expect, right? I mean, what was crucial were the later developments, not Galileo. They came after Galileo. So it looks like it may be plausible to argue that Galileo actually just wasn't that great a scientist. And that if we look at how the scientific community as a whole responded to this theory, they actually were acting rationally and they acted in a way that encouraged progress. So that's one thing we might say there. A more general point here is that the mere fact that some behaviour or some kind of argument once did help contribute to progress, and hence may do so again, doesn't entail that we should encourage that. So consider the policy of turning up 20 minutes late for your bus. There will be circumstances where this is useful. In those cases where the bus is 20 minutes late, well, you haven't wasted time waiting at the bus stop. So sometimes that will help. But obviously, we adopt a policy of getting to the bus stop for the time the bus is scheduled, because most of the time the bus isn't going to be late. Feyerabend aims to show that there is no universal method. There is no method that should be used in all circumstances. And he does this by appealing to cases where violating suggested methods has been of benefit. But surely we would all expect that, sometimes violating the method pays off. When we propose a scientific method, we're not saying that it always encourages progress or that it's the only thing that produces progress. I mean, sure, sometimes people can make lucky guesses. But what we're saying is overall we're better off following that method. And it's not obvious that the kind of argument Feyerabend makes really addresses this point. It's not clear that an appeal to any particular case in the history of science can allow you to make conclusions about the scientific method overall. Okay, a final objection concerns Feyerabend's emphasis on proliferation of theories. So it does seem to be right that science has a mechanism for generating new theories, new radical ideas, but as Peter Godfrey Smith points out, that surely is only part of the story. Science also has a mechanism for eliminating theories. We need to decide that some things just aren't worth pursuing. One of the important points raised by Kuhn in his discussion of paradigms is that science involves long-term collaboration between many people working in many fields, people who agree on certain basic ideas and they develop these ideas in detail. That's really important, and that's going to collapse if scientists are focused on developing completely new ideas and then tenaciously sticking with those ideas against all odds. I mean, think about the debate between geocentrism and heliocentrism. Eventually heliocentrism triumphed and geocentrism was eliminated. Nobody takes geocentrism seriously anymore. So we might say that that's a good thing, right? Geocentrism should be eliminated, in which case Feyerabend is going to need to explain under what conditions theories can be eliminated, or the total rejection of geocentrism is a bad thing. Feyerabend often speaks as though he thinks it's a bad thing to reject theories entirely. In which case, though, we need more detail on how this kind of approach is compatible with the large-scale, long-term collaborative work that we find in science. Scientists do try to generate new ideas, but it seems they're also quite picky about the ideas that stick around, and that seems to be an important element that Feyerabend doesn't discuss so much. So I'd like to end this with a description of modern philosophy of science that's given by John Dupre in his book The Disorder of Things. This book was written in the 90s, but I think his point remains true today. So Dupre is just describing what modern philosophy of science is like. He's not talking about Feyerabend or anything here, but I think it's interesting what he says. He says, methodological accounts of what it is to be scientific have little currency in the contemporary philosophical literature. Philosophical concerns with methodology are generally very local, either addressed to specific areas of science or, more commonly, concerned with quite particular and often technical aspects of such matters as, for example, the significance and techniques of randomization in experimental design. So the area that I'm most familiar with is philosophy of biology, and that strikes me as absolutely right. I think that that's still the case today. So very few philosophers of biology are attempting to interpret all of biology in terms of some single universal method like falsificationism. Instead, they're concerned with specific problems in specific contexts. So despite the rather controversial status of Feyerabend, it seems that his central claim, his central argument against method, is quite widely accepted in the philosophical community. Right, in the next video, we're going to look at some of the political consequences of Feyerabend's theory. But that's all for now. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.